My dad was a penny pincher. He was one that if he could save some money, he would save some money. And one of the things he did was he put in our house what was called an attic fan. Some of y'all may know what that is. It's like a fan that's in a square. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet, and you put it in the ceiling. Had little louvers that would close, and when the fan come on, the louvers would open up, and it would draw air from below into the attic fan. And what he would do, he put it in the garage, and that was at the one end of the house. All our bedrooms were at the other end of the house, and so he'd open the door that would go from the garage into the rest of the house, and then in our bedrooms, we would all open up the windows to our bedroom, and he would shut off the air conditioner every evening, and we would sleep under the wind coming in the window. And that sounds nice and everything, but Texas summers sometimes are very hot, very humid. They don't cool off much at night, so sometimes it was absolutely unbearable. And I remember the great feeling in the morning when they would he'd always got up early, shut the windows, and he'd turn the air conditioner back on, and you could just feel yourself drying out through the sweat of the night. Well, one of the things that happened was my bed was just kind of below my window at an angle, and I could see the window. And I always had this fear when I get in bed and everything would get quiet, that sometimes I'd turn over and just happen to look up at the window, and I would see, and it was a big window open up, and there was just a screen there, that I would see the silhouette of somebody standing there just staring at me as I lay in bed. And I just never would open my eyes and look at the window ever, and the worst part was, because the window's open, it got real quiet. Whenever there was a cat or a dog or a possum, I don't know, that would be walking near the window, you'd just hear the step. And you're just like, is that an animal? Is that a person? Is that an animal? Is that a person? Am I going to look up and see someone looking at me? And I just lived with this fear for a long, long time. We all have kind of fears that we had when we were a kid. For you, it may have been a fear of being left out, or maybe the fear of getting shots, or going to the dentist, or thunderstorms. We all had these childhood fears that we carried with us. And as we grew older, we kind of put away some of those fears. We overcame some of those fears, and we realized they weren't something that we should be afraid of. But even though we put away childhood fears, the truth is we never outgrow letting fear of something or someone, influence our decisions, our priorities, many times our pursuits, and our behavior. Even as adults, we're vulnerable to fear and its influence on our life. In fact, if I could ask you for a moment just to think about one of the worst decisions you ever made in life, one of those decisions that you look back on with a tremendous amount of regret, you look back on and you just go, when you think about that choice that you made, the decision that you made, that pursuit that you went after, you just look back on and go, what was I thinking? What was going through my mind that I thought that was a good choice? Think back to that. And I'm betting for many of us, if we peeled back maybe an unhealthy desire that contributed to that, maybe some other influence, if we peel all those things back, that yes, influence that, but if we peel them all back and get that back to the core or the genesis of that bad decision, we would find at the very core of it is a fear of something or someone. Maybe it was a fear of being left out, a fear of being rejected, a fear of being left behind. How many times have we made bad decisions for our family or bad financial decisions because we were just trying to keep up, because we didn't want to get left behind? So we thought we had to do something or go somewhere or buy something because we were afraid that if we didn't, we would be left behind. Maybe it's the fear of growing old, the fear of missing out. I can't tell you, over my years of ministry, this has happened to me more than once. I've had someone come up to me and say that they've connected or reconnected with a relationship of the past, and they wanted me to pray with them about whether they should pursue that relationship. And the person is already married, and they're asking me this. And my response is, heck no, I'm not going to pray about that. Go back to your spouse. But every time when I've gotten that kind of very strange request from someone, and they're serious about it, it's because they don't even realize how crazy that kind of seems to ask their pastor to pray for something like that. Why? Because this fear has gotten them to that place. They're fearful that if they don't check in or at least investigate that relationship opportunity that they might miss out on something that they don't want to miss out on. Maybe it's the fear of missing out. Maybe it's the fear of being alone, the fear of being talked about, the fear of being unnoticed, the fear of being noticed. The truth is that there is an endless list of things that we can be fearful of. And there's a little truth that is inescapable, a little takeaway that you need to tuck down and never forget, and that is this. Wherever fear is not challenged, it will control. Wherever there is a fear in our life that's not pushed back against, that is not challenged, ultimately somewhere down the line, it will develop a level, if not total control in some aspect of our life. Because wherever fear is not challenged, it will control. In the series that we're in, we've been looking at the mistakes, the failures, the sins of some of the characters of Scripture. And one of the things I love about Scripture is God doesn't just show the good side of the people of Scripture. He doesn't just show them as these perfect, super righteous individuals. He shows us them in their great steps of faith, but He also shows them at their worst moment. He shows us that they are flawed characters. And I love that about these guys and about God just being real. One, it makes the Bible more believable because we see that they're just real flawed character. And it gives me courage and encourages me because I know that I'm a flawed character. And it reminds me that God can work in and through someone like me. Well, we're looking at their moments of not their greatest triumph, but their biggest mistake or their failure or something. Because what we want to do is we want to learn from that so that we don't duplicate it. I've said through all this series, it is smart to learn from your own mistakes. It is wise to learn from someone else's mistakes. And it's always better to be wise than just smart. So today, we come to one of the most iconic characters of Scripture. His bravery and his impulsiveness makes him a very likable creature. He is kind of the bad boy of the good boys of Scripture. It's Peter. Peter is the guy, if you remember, who when Jesus was arrested and the guards grabbed hold of Jesus, Peter impulsively jumped up with a sword and cut off the guard's ear. Cut off his ear. There's a part of us that when we see that, we thought, oh, you shouldn't do that. There's another part of us that goes, wow, that is awesome. You know, there's something about it that we admire someone that would just throw caution to the wind and be reckless in the pursuit of what is right. And he was in that moment. We look at that and we think, God, that's kind of awesome. Peter was the guy that when Jesus stood up before the disciples and said, hey, you are going to abandon me in just a few moments, and not very far away. You're going to run from me. Peter was the guy who stood up and said, no way, Jesus, no way. These sorry suckers might do it, but not me, because I'm committed. I'm true blue, Jesus. I am not going to abandon you. Peter is the guy that Jesus selected to be the one that took the gospel from being a regional, mainly Jewish thing into being a worldwide thing. He was the one that became the catalyst for the gospel to go out and it become the unstoppable force that it is today. In fact, Jesus looks at Peter and says, upon this rock, speaking of Peter, I will build my church. And the church was not an institution in which he was speaking. The church was the movement of the gospel. And he says, upon this rock, upon this catalyst, upon this one, upon what he is going to do, man, the movement of the gospel of Jesus Christ is going to become unstoppable. Peter is the one that the Catholic Church hails as their first pope. I mean, when it comes to the star power of Scripture, Peter is an A-lister. But he wasn't perfect by any standard. He wasn't super righteous. He was a flawed, imperfect person. Just the kind of man that God likes to use and Satan likes to misdirect. And there's a story in Scripture in which we get a ringside seat at Peter being beat up by fear. It's when Jesus was eating for the last time with his disciples, and they had no clue what was coming. And Jesus understands that they're not ready to emotionally just consume what is about to happen. And so he looks to them, and knowing the power of fear, and he just says to them, almost like he's saying, listen, I understand what's about to happen. I want you to know I understand. He looks at them and he says, very soon you're going to abandon me. You're going to run. And as I said, Peter was the one who spoke up, and his response was so visceral. It was so emotional. It was so raw. He just said, no. These guys might abandon you, but I would never abandon you, Jesus. And if you think I would, then you are just wrong. You just don't understand that I'm all in. And that was a real response for Peter. It wasn't a facade to put on. It was real. It was emotional. It was visceral. It was raw because he was all in. He was absolutely committed. He was sold out. And so his response was so incredibly forceful. And Jesus looks at him and he says, Peter, not only are you going to deny you even know me, not just one time, not just 2 times, but 3 times. And this is not 3 times over a long period of time. You're going to do it 3 times before the rooster goes. Before the morning comes. And Peter just seems offended by Jesus' accusation, thinking Jesus just doesn't understand how committed I am. But after Jesus is arrested, this happens. John chapter 18 is where we're going to be, picking up with verse 15. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside the door. In other words, this guy had connections. Somehow he had people on the inside. He had relationships and the power of relationships, and he could get in. Peter said, no, you can't come in. The other disciples, who was known to the high priest, came back and spoke to the servant girl on duty, kind of like the bouncer, at the door, and brought Peter in. So he had connection. He got to go in. There's this courtyard, and this is where this whole initial interrogation of Jesus going on. They're hanging around. It's cold. They're warming themselves by the fire. Verse 17. You are one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I've always taught in the synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I speak the truth, why do you strike me? Then Ananias sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. I bet he's like, I know who you are. You cut my brother's ear off. Challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? I was there. Again, Peter denied it. At that moment, a rooster began to crow. Peter did what he thought he'd never do. Think about that. In a very short period of time, Peter did what he thought he'd never do. See, that's the takeaway. Fear, if not challenged, if not rejected, if not pushed back and fought against, it will ultimately cause you to do what you never thought you would do. And it would cause you to become, at least in some aspect of your life, it will cause you to become someone you never thought you would become. And we're not talking about some fringe person, some mediocre person, someone of lukewarm passion for Jesus. We're talking about Peter, the one who the movement of the church is built upon, the one who, when no one else would, stood up and said, I will not abandon you. And here's the one vocally going not once, twice, but 3 times in a short period of time, saying, I don't know this guy. Peter became what he never thought he'd become. Peter did what he never thought he would do. And what got him there was fear. See, this is why in Scripture, one of the most common, repetitive themes is to fear not. And that's not appealing to your intellectual, just fear not. Okay, I will fear not. Aha. It's not appealing to your intellectual. It is helping us to understand that there is going to be things that cause us fear. There are going to be people and things that we fear. They're going to well up in our life. It's not really like we're in control of that. And what the Scripture is repeatedly trying to tell us to do is trying to get us to recognize that, so that we then, our response would be, this is a fear that I must not let go on unchallenged. I must not let go on unaddressed and just ignore and not push back against it. And over and over, listen to some of these verses, and this is just a sampling. Psalms 118, verse 6 7. Listen to the writer here and listen to what he's trying to do. He is saying, I'm not going to let this fear in me go on unchallenged. I'm not going to let it just persist in my life and unaddressed and not provide any pushback. Listen to how he's pushing back on the fear. Verse 118, verse 6 7 says, and the Lord is with me. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? The Lord is with me. He is my helper. I look in triumph on my enemies. Here's what he's doing. He's recognizing that somewhere in here he has this fear going on, and it appears to be a fear of someone. And he's saying, I'm going to push back. I'm going to address that this is something I can't allow go on in my life without a fight, because if I do, it will lead me to a place I don't want to be. It will cause me to do things that I believe I wouldn't do and become someone that I said I'd never become. Isaiah chapter 41, verse 10. So do not fear, God speaking here, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. You hear God, what's he saying? Push back against it. Address it. Fight it. Don't let fear go on unaddressed in your life, because ultimately it will cause you to do what you thought you'd never do and become someone you thought you'd never become. Mark chapter 5, verse 36. This is Jesus speaking. Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe. It's almost like Jesus saying, fight it, fight it, fight it. I know it's there. I know there's fear in you, but don't let it go on unaddressed. Because if you do, it will cause you to do what you thought you'd never do and become who you thought you'd never become. Then Joshua chapter 1, verse 9, God speaking, have I not commanded you? In other words, do you not get this yet? Have you not understood this? Do you understand the weight of this? Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. What's he saying? Don't let that fear win. Don't let it have its influence. Don't let it go on unaddressed and unchallenged in your life, because if you do, it's going to cause you to be discouraged. It's going to have more and more influence in who you are and what you do. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And that's just a taste of the number of Scripture that challenge us to challenge and to push back on fear in our lives. Here's what I know. I know that there are many in this room right now that are not challenging a fear in their life, and maybe it's a fear that's been in their life for a long, long time. They're not pushing back against it. There are people within the sound of my voice right now that maybe you've let that fear go on so long, unchallenged, unaddressed in your life that you don't even think of it as a fear anymore because its influence has gotten so great in your life. It just kind of, well, this is how you do life. This is what you pursue. These are decisions you make. And it's all because of a fear you never addressed. And it shaped you. That you don't even recognize that the whole core of it, the nucleus of it, is why you're making the choices you're making is because of a fear that went on unaddressed in your life. And maybe it is the fear of not keeping up. Maybe it's the fear of missing out. Maybe it's a fear of being alone, the fear of not being included, the fear of growing old, the fear of going broke. And that fear is, and if it hasn't already, it will, if left unaddressed, unchallenged, it will cause you to do some things that you thought you'd never do. It will cause you to hold out on God. And ultimately, if left unaddressed, it will cause you to walk down a road of becoming someone you never thought you would become. Peter struggled with this, not just here at Jesus' arrest, but later on even, it was a struggle. You see, one of the things that happened in Christianity early on is Christianity started out really after the resurrection of Christ. It started out as kind of a Jewish thing. In fact, it was seen by the Romans and even some Jews as just a form of Judaism. Just a sect that was developing in Judaism. And Judaism had various sects. Essenes, other people that took Judaism, they're all Jews, but just a different little take on it within Judaism. And they are seeing Christianity as part of that. But God used Peter and Paul both to really break out of that and show the world that Christianity is about humanity's contact with God. It's not just a Jewish thing. In fact, early Judaism, Christians would say, early Christians who were Jews, they would say you'd have to become a Jew before you became a Christian. Because it was just seen as it was a part of that. And so God takes Paul and Peter and breaks it from that and shows that it is a worldwide movement. And all of a sudden, not just Jews, but Gentiles, that's you and me, anyone who's not Jew, we're becoming Christians. We're beginning to see Jesus as the Messiah and embracing that. And all of a sudden, the gospel began to just spread. But early Christianity struggled. It struggled internally with Jewish Christians kind of believing they were the true blue Christians, and Gentile Christians were second class. And so there was this struggle within the movement of Christianity to realize that there is no class system when it comes to being a child of the King. And so what would happen sometimes is Jewish Christians would look on Gentiles and say, yes, you're a Christian, but you're just not as good as I am. I'm just on a little higher level. Well, Peter didn't really have that issue. But the Peter struggled with this whole fear of man kind of thing. And so what would happen sometimes is he would go, and when he was around Jewish Gentile Christians, he would treat them with respect. He didn't really have this hang-up. He believed they were true followers of Christ, equal to anyone else. And so he would hang out with them. But, as we'll see in a moment, when there would be sometimes Jewish Christians show up, and sometimes the headquarters of Christianity at this time was Jerusalem. That was the church. And James, Jesus' half-brother, was the leader of that church. And they would sometimes send Christians out to kind of check on new churches that were developing, make sure the theology, everything was going right, and they'd send people out. And Peter would be fine with the Gentile Christians until some of the Jews. Then he's like, hey, yeah, he'd back away a little bit because he was a Jewish Christian first, because he was a Jew. And so he'd back away, try to be friends with it. Fear of man. Paul sees this happening, and it ticks him off. And he confronts Peter over it. Galatians chapter 2, Paul writes about it. Verse 11, it says, when Caiaphas, now that is another name for Peter, that's Paul's name for Peter, it's part of Peter's name, and it's what Paul liked to call him. When Caiaphas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, and he's saying before these guys that came from James. What's he talking about? James was the leader of the Jerusalem church. He said, before these guys that James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, sent these guys to us, these Jewish Christians, before they showed up, he says, he used to eat with the Gentiles. Talking about Gentile Christians. He was hanging out with them. They were fine. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belong to the circumcised group. Again, what's he talking about there? Who gets circumcised? Jewish. The Jewish Christian group. The ones that James had sent from the Jerusalem church. These Christians who were Jewish Christians. He was afraid of those who belonged. He feared not being embraced and accepted by them. The other Jews, that's the ones who were with Peter, hanging out with the Gentiles, joined him in this hypocrisy. So that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. Young Barnabas, who was new and developing and watching this going on, and all of a sudden he began to go, well, I guess this is how you act, you know. Oh yeah, I guess these Gentile Christians are second class, because he watched Peter, his mentor, do the same thing. You see, the fear that is unchallenged is a fear that will control. And if it is left unchallenged, it ultimately will cause you to do some things you never thought you'd do and become someone you never thought you'd become. So how do you push back against it? How do you fight fear? You're going to have them. The fears are going to come up, and they're going to be unique to you. How do you fight against that? The only way to fight unhealthy, destructive fear is with fear. It's kind of like if you like the outdoors, or if you've been in parts of the country, including our own here, where wildfires can flare up. You'll know that one of the ways that forestry people fight destructive fire is with fire. At certain times of the year, they'll go out in a controlled situation and they'll use fire to burn up and consume the underbrush that is just fuel for wildfires. They literally fight fire with fire. The only way you are able to deal with destructive fear in your life is with fear. And that is, to starve destructive fear, you have to feed healthy fear. What is healthy fear? Proverbs chapter 19, verse 23 says, the fear of the Lord leads to life. Then one rests content, untouched by trouble. What does that mean? What does it look like? It means that one of the things you want to do is you want to pursue things that increase a sense of awe and fear of God. That's why worship is so important. Worship's not just singing songs. It's not just make us feel good. Worship, because music is just a way to go through the intellect and go to the heart. It's why so much music out there is about love. It's because it has ability to go through the mind and hit the heart. One of the reasons we worship in the way we do is to just kind of refresh and remind us of the awe and the majesty and the glory of God. You want to do things that. You want to get into Scripture. You want to spend time with God. So not just so intellectually you know more, so that your sense of the awe of God is constantly refreshed, because when there's a greater sense of the awe of God, what goes along with that is a greater sense of the fear of God. And the greater you have, the more you feed the fear of God, the more you starve the fear that is unhealthy and destructive. How do you know that's happening? You know you're developing a healthy sense of the fear of God when you are more burdened with disappointing God than you are disappointing others. You know you're having a healthy sense of the fear of God when you're more concerned with what God thinks than what your group thinks. When you believe that His purpose is more important in every situation than someone's acceptance. When you begin to define success as living out God's principles more than it is keeping up with everybody else. When you come to a place where losing a sense of the awe of God is more frightening to you than losing a friend group. I think that's so important. And it's a little long, but I want to repeat it again. You know that you're developing a healthy sense of a good fear, the fear and the awe of God. And you're starving a fear of something or someone else that's destructive. You know that that process is taking place when you become more burdened with disappointing God than disappointing others. When you come to a place where you're more concerned with what God thinks than what your group thinks. When you get to a place where you believe His purpose is more important than someone's acceptance. When you begin to define success by living out God's purpose than it is by keeping up with everyone else. And when you come to that place where losing the awe of God is more frightening to you than losing a friend group. When you begin to see that take place within you, then you know that you're developing a higher level of healthy fear that will then starve out the destructive fear. And when that happens, you know what you get? You get two things. One, you get clarity. Clarity about your life. Because as long as you're living driven by the fear of something or someone, you're constantly asking, do they accept me? Do they accept me? Am I keeping up? Am I too old? Am I missing out? And all this thing, and the noise is great and chaos, and you don't know from minute to minute where you're heading. And life gets so confusing. But when you begin to live developing and nurturing a fear of God over the fear of everything else, all of a sudden you have clarity. You know what to do. You may not do it every time, but you know what you need to do in situations. You know when you need to speak and when you need to get out. You know what's the right thing in a situation to do. You just get greater clarity on what life is about, what success is about, and where you need to go. When you have a healthy sense of the fear of God, starving out unhealthy fear, the one thing you get is clarity. The second thing you get is freedom. You get freedom. All of a sudden, you stop living for the things that will enslave you. You get freedom from other people's opinion. You get the freedom from worrying whether someone accepts you or not. You get freedom from trying your best to keep up with everybody else. You just get a tremendous amount of freedom as you live for the purpose and the applause of God because you fear Him more than you live for the purpose or the applause of anything or anyone else. That's what you get. And that's why it's worth it. So where do you start? You start by naming that fear. You can't battle against something you haven't identified. You can't overcome something that you haven't even acknowledged exists. You start by just coming in and saying, God, I need to be honest. Maybe you already know, so I really don't need to be honest with you, but I've not been honest with myself. And so, God, I just need to acknowledge, you know what? I've been letting go far too long unaddressed a fear of not being accepted, or fear of not being perceived successful, or fear of not having all this, or whatever yours is. God, I just want to name it. I fear and name it. I've let it have too much influence. I've let it have too much control. I've let it go on in my life unaddressed for far too long, and it's had influence. And at times it's caused me to do what I never thought I'd do, and times in some areas of my life it's caused me to become someone that I thought I'd never become. The first thing, you got to name it, because you can't fight against something that you don't identify. And then you need to value and prioritize those things, including worship and study and your own private time with God. And we're all different. It's going to be unique for some of us, what that path looks like. But you need to find those things in your life that nurture your sense of the awe and what comes with that, the fear of God. Because the more you nurture that and the more you build it up in your life, the more the fear of something and someone else is starved out. And let me tell you something. If you do those two things, you don't ignore it anymore, pretend like it doesn't exist, pretend like it doesn't have influence, but you name that thing, that fear that you struggle with. And then you make it your life pursuit to constantly be checking and doing the things that increases your sense of the awe of the majesty and the power and the person of God. You will find yourself positioning you to become who you've always wanted to become. And do some things that you're proud that you're doing that a lot of other people won't. Don't fail to understand the power